So yeah, welcome to the training. So for anyone that's just joined, my name's Carla. I'm in charge of the training and support at Five Education. Thanks so much for joining. So this training is specifically aimed for anyone working in schools, but I'd say predominantly support staff and teaching assistants who may not have had a huge amount of trauma training. So I've only got kind of an hour to kind of touch on trauma. There's a lot of things to go into. So I can't go into everything, but I've hopefully covered some really key points, which I hope you'll find really useful. Um, so yeah, it's predominantly aimed for teaching assistants because I feel like as a teaching assistant or a support member of staff at a school, sometimes you're kind of thrown in to supporting really traumatized children and you might not have had the training needed. So I hope, I hope you find it beneficial. And at the end, please do ask me any questions if you need to. So we'll get started. So just a little bit about me. My current role here is in charge of kind of training and support at Five Education, and I also kind of provide support for our supply teaching assistants. So some of you I've met before. So I deliver training, I deliver team teach training, and I also give kind of support to all the teaching assistants that we work with who are working in some quite tricky schools or maybe having problems with the children they're working with. So I kind of give them support plans to help them through. So I'm just going to talk a bit about my background just before we get started. So my background is actually in teaching dance. That's what I first kind of started with. And alongside that, I began kind of inclusion support work, mostly with children aged 3 to 15. So I've worked in lots of different schools, mainstream and some special needs schools across Bristol, London, and also in Australia. My favorite kind of age group is definitely Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2. I have done some work with older children as well, but those are kind of my more specific age groups. So when I worked in Australia, between 2013 and 2015, I spent a lot of time working with some students, Aboriginal students who'd experienced a lot of racial prejudice. And that's kind of when I became really interested in trauma. So I decided after that I was either going to go into educational psychology, but I kind of got put off the idea because you don't actually spend a whole lot of time with children. You do a lot of observations, report writing. So I decided to go into play therapy. So it's a form of psychotherapy for young children, and it kind of helps them process difficult feelings, difficult emotions, traumatic experiences without having a formal kind of sit down talking therapy session. So now I'm really lucky to work in three really amazing schools. I also do a little bit of private work now. And I've just started working with children in fostering and adoption. So more recently, I decided to kind of expand my training a bit. So I started training in parent-child attachment therapy. And I'm currently training in DDP, which is a form of child psychotherapy. And it basically aims to strengthen the bond between traumatized children and their caregivers. So what I'm going to kind of do in the training, hopefully kind of equip you with a bit more of an understanding about trauma and the effects on the body, emotional regulation and relational aspects as well. Offer you some new skills and techniques that I really hope can be shared with your team. Hopefully improve the emotional and physical safety for the children and the staff in some of your schools, and to kind of give you some more holistic ideas that can be learned and shared with others too. So I'm going to talk a bit about neuroscience, so what's going on in the brain, when you're working with traumatized children, a little bit about the type of language that is really beneficial to use with certain types of children. I'm going to talk a little bit about the autism and ADHD crossover with trauma, what trauma actually is. And also I'm going to kind of put in some of my recommendations, the things that work for me as a therapist as well, that I think could be really beneficial to be kind of shared and passed on to other people. So just a little bit of content warning. I've tried not to make it too morbid, but obviously the subject is trauma. So there will be kind of a few things about abuse that might be quite triggering for some people. So just to let you know, if you're finding anything difficult, you can obviously opt out or take a little break. Okay. So a little bit about the statistics on trauma. So how big is the problem, and specifically in schools as well. So this is just a bit of information from UK Trauma Council. So more than 1 in 3 children and young people are exposed to at least one potentially traumatic event by the age of 18. So obviously that is huge. I'm not sure where that statistic, what year that statistic was from, but I expect that's probably kind of increased in 2025, 2026. And this is a little kind of fact. Again, it's quite an old statistic, but more about how education and, you know, the impact of trauma in education. So 1 out of every 4 children attending school has been exposed to a traumatic event, which can impact school performance, impair learning, and cause physical and emotional distress. So that was from 2008. So again, that has obviously probably risen quite a lot by now. And I just thought I'd put this in here. So there's actually currently no mandatory or legal requirement for UK school staff to undergo any trauma-informed training. So the Department of Education is beginning to kind of emphasize training that aligns with trauma-informed principles. But as I mentioned, there's no kind of legal requirement. I believe that there should be, because it's such a big problem now. And hopefully kind of the government is going to start making changes in that area. So this is just kind of my definition of what I think kind of trauma is. So trauma refers to an event or experience that is considered deeply disturbing or distressing for an individual. So due to the traumatic experience, the individual will then have moments of feeling overwhelmed, heightened emotions, and feelings of helplessness. A traumatic event can either be singular or an experience of multiple traumatic events. Trauma can affect people differently, and they can cause psychological, emotional, and physical effects on the brain and the body. So I hope that kind of explains what trauma is to anyone who is very kind of new to the subject as well. So different types of trauma. So some of these you will have heard of, but some of them might be kind of new to some people. So I'm going to go over them. And then there's more kind of complex types of trauma, which I'll explain a bit more thoroughly about what those look like. So acute trauma. So this is a single event, often unexpected or sudden. So examples can include sudden loss of someone, an assault, a car accident, a threatening incident. Then there's chronic trauma, so repeated and prolonged exposure, threatening or stressful situations. So examples can include repeated illness, exposure to war, ongoing abuse, including witnessing abuse or extreme bullying. Complex trauma, so multiple types of traumatic events. Examples can include ongoing childhood neglect and abuse, exploitation, neglect, both emotional and physical. Generational trauma. So this might be a type of trauma that not so many people are aware of. So trauma can actually be passed down through generations of families. So this can be due to historical trauma, such as slavery, systemic racism, war, or forced migration. And then moving on from this and kind of linking to generational trauma is intergenerational trauma. So this is parents who have experienced their own trauma and often pass on the psychological and physiological effects to their children without kind of being aware of it sometimes as well. So because of this, their children can then demonstrate learned behaviors from the traumatized parents. So stress responses, behavioral or emotional patterns, or certain communication styles. And then there's developmental trauma. So this is one of the most complex types of trauma. So it can happen in the really kind of critical development stage, which is the 0 to 3 period. And this can cause really severe attachment complications, which can affect social development and cognitive abilities. So children who have had attachment difficulties, this is usually when they've had inconsistent care from parents or caregivers. And it can really kind of affect their attachment style and building relationships in the future. So I'd say developmental trauma is definitely one of the most complex types of trauma that you could be working with. Okay, let's move on. So just a bit now about how trauma actually affects the brain. So a bit about neuroscience. So a traumatized child's brain will have adapted in order to survive. So the brain will change how it processes emotion, threat, and self-control. So what happens if a child has experienced trauma, their brain will kind of automatically prioritize survival over reason. So the amygdala, which you can see kind of in the diagram, is in charge of the emotional regulation in the brain. And what happens, it's kind of unable to switch off and almost becomes hyperactive if the child has been traumatized. So it's constantly scanning for threats and danger, and it keeps the child in this really kind of heightened and hypervigilant state, which can be really overwhelming for them. And then we've got the prefrontal cortex. So this is in charge of the decision making and rational thinking. So if this isn't working properly, it will make it much harder to think rationally, regulate emotions, or it can also cause complete shutdown as well. You often find emotional instability and social withdrawal as well if the prefrontal cortex isn't working properly. So just a bit about traumatized brains and memory as well. So traumatic memories are often kind of stored as fragments and are held in the body as an emotion, sensation, or noise, or image, sorry. So this can lead to flashbacks, a body reaction without a conscious memory, or a very strong emotional response to certain triggers. So the responses can make absolutely no sense to the child as well. So they can have these really kind of strong reactions, emotional reactions or physical reactions, and they can be terrifying because they don't make any sense to the child. They don't know where it's coming from. So just a little kind of key point to remember as well. So trauma responses are adaptive and not pathological. So that's just something important to remember. So, how trauma affects the brain. So I'll talk about this diagram in a minute. So some of you might have seen this picture before. So what can happen? The whole brain can kind of reshape. So it's kind of been traumatized. The brain is now adjusted to be hyper alert. And then it's constantly scanning for threats. So there's constant high levels of cortisol, which is the stress hormone. And this can cause long-term for the hippocampus, which is in charge of memory and context, to shrink, which can be really detrimental. Learning and memory are impaired. difficulty distinguishing past from present, so that can come really blurred and can be very confusing. So the amygdala that processes the information becomes really overreactive. So the child or young person is constantly thinking there is danger all around them. This can obviously impact a sense of safety, and the child can feel kind of almost broken and unsafe. This obviously affects the attachment as well, so they're unable to form trusting relationships. And what happens long term because of this, the nervous system then kind of becomes stuck. And it's in a state of hyperarousal. It's known as the truncated response or the kind of delayed response. And it's almost stuck in a loop, stuck in a hyperarousal loop. So just a bit about this diagram as well, so you can see kind of the effects of trauma on the developing brain. So this is a scan by Dr. Bruce Perry, who is a child psychiatrist. And so you can see, obviously, on the left side, that is a healthy, normal brain of a 3-year-old child who has received nurture, they've received care, they've had a really good and strong attachment with their caregivers. And then I think the brain on the other side, I believe that's from a child in a Romanian orphanage who suffered extreme neglect, no kind of contact or nurture. So the brain has become really kind of undeveloped. So it can really have a huge impact on the development of the brain, dependent on kind of care that you're receiving as you grow up. So how can we recognize trauma? So with awareness and understanding, trauma can be identified by educational staff. Sometimes it can be really hard to identify. I think, some children can go completely under the radar. So it's important that you're really kind of checking in and looking out for, there's more obvious signs. And I'd say a selection of signs is really important. Than kind of just seeing one sign and pinpointing it on trauma. It's really important that you have a good amount of evidence as to what the signs are. So I'm just going to go over a couple of those now. So the physical signs, headaches, stomach aches, often saying they're feeling sick, and this is kind of repetitive things that the child is saying, and they're kind of complaining about this a lot. Obviously self-harm, so to themselves or other people, not eating or overeating, hyperactivity, and then there's also developmental signs, so regression, loss of toileting skills, that's one of them, sucking thumbs or sucking on clothes. And then we've got behavioral signs, so not sleeping, appearing very tired, hypervigilance, being overly clingy with adults as well, avoiding social interaction, lack of concentration in class, being very wary of certain people or places, and then regressive behaviors as well, such as wetting and soiling. And then we've got the emotional signs. So being highly emotional, or the other way, withdrawn and very quiet, signs of depression and severe sadness, kind of fearing everything, that can be a sign, high levels of anxiety, very angry or violent outbursts, and really strong reactions that come out of nowhere. So these are the triggers that I've spoken about previously. So obviously, being aware of the signs can help you recognize a child who may have experienced traumatic events. Children might display a combination of symptoms, but some of the symptoms often kind of overlap with other emotional or behavioral symptoms as well. So if you do see a combination of the symptoms above that I've mentioned in a child, there's many approaches that you can use to help, which I'm going to go over. I will go over those approaches in a minute, but before that, I just want to talk about the crossover between ADHD, autism, and trauma, because this is quite important. So quite often, trauma symptoms can get mixed up with those of ADHD and autism. This is quite common. So this can obviously make it really difficult for a child to receive an appropriate treatment plan. Sometimes I find with parents as well, when I'm talking to them about their children's behavior, they will often say they've definitely got autism, they've definitely got ADHD. And that can be quite a tricky subject because you're often working with children who probably have experienced a bit of trauma and the parents aren't aware that they've experienced trauma, or it could be that generational trauma thing as well. So the parents might have had a very traumatic upbringing. So that trauma is then passed down to their children, and they're not sure why their children are behaving this way. So they can say it's definitely autism, it's definitely ADHD. So that can be really tricky. And sometimes it takes a bit of time to kind of build trust with the parents, if you are working with parents like that, to get to the bottom of the child's history and their past as well, and just kind of make them a bit more aware that their past or their own experiences might have affected their children as well. So as I was saying, so children with autism or ADHD can have these cognitive issues as well, sensory-related problems, proprioception difficulties, so that's our sense of balance, and emotional dysregulation. So all of those symptoms there can be seen in children who've experienced trauma as well. So there can be this real confusion with the crossover. Also, some of the symptoms of autism and ADHD appear much more familiar than those of trauma. So you could be seeing emotional dysregulations or cognitive issues, and you're thinking, okay, this child's definitely got autism or definitely got ADHD. They're hyperactive, they must have ADHD. So trauma-informed approaches are obviously different from an approach you'd use with a child of autism. So if a child is being assessed, it's really, really important that they are being assessed by a professional who has a really good understanding of trauma, so there's not a misdiagnosis there. I've already mentioned be very mindful when you're talking to parents about the crossover between autism and trauma. I think that's really important that that's made quite clear. Obviously, some children who have experienced trauma might have autism and ADHD as well. That's a possibility, of course. But like I said, if they are going through an assessment, it's just so important that if there is a history of any kind of trauma, that it's done by someone who has a very good understanding. This is because the interventions for autism are much more focused on behavioral techniques, whereas the interventions for trauma are much more based on relational and regulatory. So working on those attachment and relational interventions. Okay. Right, I'm going to talk now about the nervous system and understanding kind of trauma responses that children and young people have. So there's a quote here from Susan Bannett, a psychotherapist. So traumatic events, by definition, overwhelm our ability to cope. When the mind becomes flooded with emotion, a circuit breaker is thrown that allows us to survive the experience fairly intact. The cost of this blown circuit is emotion frozen within the body. We cannot heal until we fully move through the trauma, including all the feelings of the event. Okay, so what happens in this situation? It's called kind of the suppressed or blocked response. So in trauma-related psychology, a suppressed response refers to an incompletion reaction to a traumatic event or memory. So what happens is the traumatized person does not process or experience full emotional responses that should occur. I'm going to give you a really clear example of this now. So first example of a completed fight or flight response. So a young girl is withdrawing some money out of a cash point. She turns around and there's an older group of teens there. They attempt to steal her money and attack her. So because her developed rational fight and flight response kicks in, she is able to defend herself. She defends herself and she's able to kind of fight them off and run away. So that's a healthy flight or fight response. So this is a healthy survival response. It works effectively as needed, and she's able to complete the correct response in that moment. So, second example of a suppressed or blocked fight or flight response. So a young girl is regularly threatened and humiliated by a family member. Her fight mode kicks in as normal, but the urge to fight isn't safe and it's not as effective as it should be, as the family member is too strong or too intimidating. So therefore, her fight mode is stopped and disrupted. Her flight response also kicks in, but she feels like she can't flee and she ends up frozen or kind of trapped in the situation. So she now only knows to go into survival mode, also known as collapse, because of the shutdown. The fight and flight responses remain stuck in that uncompleted system. So the long-term effects of the blocked response, obviously the child is now stuck in this spiral of the uncompleted cycle. They also might feel like an overpowering urge to complete the cycle. They may have the urge to fight or run away as the nervous system tries to repair early experience. The child feels overwhelmed, they're trapped in this cycle, and they are repeatedly re-experiencing the terror of the incident. Also, many forms of children who are neglected also have their survival response blocked. Children who have not had their needs met emotionally as well can have a disrupted nervous system. So what happens with this in a lot of schools, we then kind of misunderstand the child's behaviours. So the behaviour of the child can appear disruptive. So the children are then kind of prevented from completing their fight or flight response, and they're stopped from doing it they're appearing that they're being disruptive. So what we need to do and kind of think about and change is encouraging children to complete their cycle with safe physical interventions, safe spaces, emotional regulation, and use of language as well. So physical interventions are really, really important to help children kind of work through that cycle and that trauma. So repetitive movements are really effective, safe movements that can kind of regulate the body and are repeated continuously so they're familiar for the child, and then that child or young person is able to complete that stress response. So anything physical like running, pad work can be obviously done in a safe way. That can be really effective. Rugby, drumming, so banging something really hard, fast-paced walks around the playground, obstacle courses that promote kind of deep pressure movements. So pushing against the hard surface or pushing against the floor, jumping and landing with your feet flat on the floor. So getting that connection to your body. After dysregulation as well, children can respond really well to a rhythm to help kind of regulate them again and bring them kind of back to the room. So only kind of do this once the child is kind of calmer and they're starting to kind of readjust to normality. And you can do things kind of like tapping your own rhythm on your knees just to kind of get the child to hear you and get in sync with the rhythm. You could hum a song. If the child is ready and it's safe, you can pat on the child's shoulders like this, only if they're calm enough. And this can really kind of help bring them back to the room and regulate them after they've had like a big emotional dysregulation. So yeah, a bit more about trauma-informed language. So when incidents like this happen, it's really important that you normalize the child's urge to fight or flee during the recovery stage, so after the traumatic response has happened. So you could say things like, do you know it's normal for you to want to run away or fight if something stressful happens to you? So lots of children who have had bad things happen to them can behave like this. So make sure you reflect on it and really normalize it so there's no kind of sense of shame for the child after it's happened. Using empathy obviously is really important as well. And this can be really effective, especially with young children, if you name and refer to the part of the body that the child is using to fight or flee. So things like, I can hear you're really upset with the people around you. This must make you feel really sad. I can see your body is trying to push people away. So you're naming what you're seeing. Staying connected with the child during the heat of the moment is really important as well. So using really short but meaningful statements. So I'm here with you. I'm here to keep you safe. After the incident, if you need to deliver consequences as well, because it's really important if obviously a child is being unsafe, you deliver the consequences, but you're doing it in a non-authoritative way with a non-shameful approach as well. So things like, it must be hard to be missing out on playtime after what happened. I can see that's really hard. What do you think about this? So being reflective with the child. I hope that's helpful and you can kind of use some of those examples in kind of recovery stage. So the next bit I'm going to talk about is more kind of trauma-informed language, and it's something that I'm kind of studying at the moment. It's called PACE. Some of you may have heard of this, and it's a form of language. It's actually developed by a psychologist called Dan Hughes. And it's aimed specifically to repair relationships, particularly with children who've experienced trauma, primarily with parents who are working with children who are have been adopted or who they're fostering, so very traumatized children who've gone to be with a new family, and there's obviously a relationship there that needs to be repaired and worked on, but it can be really, really effective as well if we're using it in schools, and it can be practiced by everyone. And it stands for playfulness, acceptance, curiosity, and empathy. So I try and use PACE quite a lot when I'm working with the children, especially if there's moments where they're becoming really heightened. So it can obviously play a really pivotal role in education as well if it's practiced by lots of people. It's developed through the research in attachment theory and neuroscience as well. And it really kind of fosters those safe relationships, allowing the child to build secure connections again and getting them to learn to trust adults. So we can use PACE in the following scenarios. Working with children who have attachment difficulties with adults, this consistency will really kind of strengthen relationship over time. You can use it during emotional dysregulation as well. It's really effective if you continuously use this approach during emotional dysregulation. Using PACE will also help the adult stay calm rather than be reactive. So it can really help calm you down as well. Because obviously, if you're in a really heightened situation with a child, you can say the wrong things, you can shout, all kinds of things can go wrong. So using PACE and being really aware about how you're communicating can help regulate yourself as well, which is really important when you're trying to calm a dysregulated child down. And then relationship repair, so after dysregulation. So once a child is in a position when they are calm and regulated, you can use PACE when repairing relationships after an incident. So also just something really important to remember, because when I first started learning about PACE recently, I wasn't aware of this. You do not have to use it in the order that it's written out. It's really important that you adapt it for the situation you're in. So I would say, obviously, using a playful approach isn't great when a child is in a really heightened moment. Being playful with them can just kind of make them more angry or more upset. So they might need empathy. They might need you to use a more empathetic approach first. Also, using PACE with the parents you're working with, whose children you're working with, sorry, can be really good at just kind of building a bit more of a connection with parents. Sometimes you'll find you're working with parents and they're incredibly kind of closed off. They don't want to talk, they don't want to give you information. They don't want to tell you about how they're feeling. So using PACE with parents can really help as well. So just kind of empathizing with them a bit, like, God, that must be really, really hard. What's going on at home, or that must be really difficult for you. Just trying to give them a bit more empathy can really help build those bonds and connections with the parents as well. So I'm just going to go over a couple of examples. I'm not going to do all of them, about how you can kind of use PACE in practice. So obviously, playfulness, this can really help diffuse heightened situations and lighten the mood. So like I said before, just remember that playfulness may not be appropriate in the immediate moment of a risky situation. So it's best not to use it when things are kind of really heightened. So it can be more effective in a low level situation before the child is at crisis point. And then we've got acceptance. So acceptance is mostly about validating a child's feelings. So being non-judgmental, letting them know it's okay how they feel. We're accepting all the feelings behind the child's behavior. We still need to let the child know if their behavior isn't acceptable to us, though. That's quite important. So if the child is, or young person has done something that is totally unacceptable to you, it's important that you let them know that way. But just like a bit of a scenario here. So a child you're working with says, "Oh, just leave me alone. I know you hate me anyway." So a really good accepting response would be something like, "I can see that you're angry with me, and I'm so sorry that you're feeling that way." So you're accepting what they're saying. Okay. Then we've got curiosity. So this can obviously be really important. You need to demonstrate a genuine interest in why they are displaying challenging behavior. Being curious about the child's behavior then makes sense of feelings that they may not understand. Curious language always needs to be non-threatening as well, and think about asking open-ended questions. So I'll give you another scenario here. So a child is dysregulated and they're knocking over chairs in a classroom. So your curious response could be something like this. So it seems like you're having a really difficult time right now. I wonder what's going on. So you're kind of naming what you see. You can see they're finding things hard, but you're just being curious and seeing if you can kind of ask those open-ended questions. And then finally, empathy. So obviously being empathetic is really crucial. Put yourselves in the child's shoes and feel what they feel. So remember, we're not there to fix them, but we're there to be in the moment with them. And make sure you always allow the child to feel understood. So I think with empathy, when obviously we are told that we need to be calm and remain calm if a child is becoming really dysregulated, yeah, that's really important. But I think a child can totally sense whether you're being calm or you're actually being genuine. So I would say a child, they don't need a calm adult, they need a connected adult. They need to know that you are genuinely connected with how they're feeling in that moment and not just kind of pretending, I'm fine, I'm calm, I'm okay. You need to be connected with them. They'd much rather have a connected adult who's feeling what they're feeling than a person that's pretending to be calm, appearing calm, but actually inside they're terrified. Okay, so just try and remember that. A child is seeking a connected adult, not a calm adult. Okay, so I'm just going to go over now just some of my recommendations, which I think are really helpful. I'm definitely not an expert in trauma. I think for anyone to say they're an expert is, I mean, it takes years to research and understand trauma. It's so complex. There's so many different types of trauma. There's the whole thing to do with attachment theory as well. It's a very big subject. So I'm definitely not an expert, but I'm still learning as well. But I really hope some of the advice I've given you and then some of my recommendations now will hopefully be things that you can practice, because I definitely find that they work with practice with the children that I work with. So the first bit I'm going to talk about is relational stability. So with this, bear with me. Let me just go back to the slide I was on. There we go. Relational stability. So this is kind of the first stage of trauma recovery. So that child, before any kind of recovery can happen, relational stability is so important. So providing safe and predictable language, routines, and structure that is really familiar for the child or the young person every day when they're coming to school. Sometimes, obviously, children can have emotional dysregulations throughout the day. Normally, when something triggers the child, if a child is having an extreme reaction to something, so if you've picked up that you've managed to pick up what the triggers are, it's really important that you have a planned response. So thinking about sensory-based activities that can be really effective once the child reaches a calmer level. Having limited physical and verbal communication when a child is in crisis is really important. Obviously, sometimes you will need to step in and use physical intervention if you have to keep a child safe, if it's got to that level. But don't overwhelm the child with too much language. Just short statements, take a pause. If the child is getting angry with what you're saying, take pauses and just kind of check in with them every now and then. Co-breathing, this is something that is really effective. So this can be really effective when you are kind of talking to the child after the incident, or you're with a child that is starting to become heightened, but you can bring them back down. So just breathing calmly whilst you're sat next to the child, so their breathing becomes in sync with yours, so they're co-regulating with you without realizing. That can be really, really effective. Also, just practicing this generally when you're working with a child with trauma, and think about that co-breathing. It can be really, really beneficial. Couple more exercises here. Obviously, sitting on therapy balls can be really effective. Sensory-based obstacles, like I mentioned before, where the child is pushing or kind of pulling, feeling grounded. Repetitive movements with a rhythm, so singing, clapping, walking to a beat, things that help calm the nervous system. Something I also put in, introducing grounding objects. So objects that are familiar to the child that they can go to if they're having an overwhelming incident, and that those objects are there and they're safe for them every time this happens. One thing I want to talk about as well is when child's kind of regress in their behavior and go back to developmental stages that are appearing younger than their actual stage or age that they are. So this can happen during dysregulation, but it can also happen after a dysregulation as well. So some children who've experienced trauma will regress developmentally and go back to the age that they were when they experienced that certain traumatic event. So what I say to people, if you do see these kind of behaviors, is try to meet them at the stage they're at, not the age they actually are. So I sometimes have this during sessions with children. I'll have kids who kind of curl up on the floor. I will get down next to them on the floor and meet them where they're at. I will curl up on the floor as well, because that's what the child needs in that moment. They don't need you to say things like stop being a baby, you're old enough not to do that, you're old enough not to speak like that. You need to meet them where they're at. Also, this doesn't mean that you have to kind of talk to a child of a kind of baby voice, but if a child is using this kind of voice where they are talking kind of younger than they are, just kind of lower the tone of your voice and just be a bit more empathetic with them. So you're meeting them where they're at. Okay. Couple more bits here. So traumatized children can project their experiences onto you. This is basically their way of just showing you how awful that they feel. And they're doing this in a way which can appear really personal to you, and it can seem like it's a personal attack. Remember, it's not a personal attack. It's just the child's way of showing you, I feel so awful. I've had all these awful things happening to me, and I just want to show you how they feel. But they're not able to verbalize how they feel, so they're projecting onto you. So remember, if this happens, try not to react. Don't hold on to the feelings that you have. It's not about you. Try and remember that. Do remain really calm and remember to practice that co-regulation with the child and hold those feelings for the child. Once that child realizes you're a safe person and you're not going to react to them, then this should definitely get a lot easier. Respond authentically as well. So if a child is having a heightened moment, sometimes before kind of saying something straight away, take a breath before intervening, connect with yourself, regulate with yourself, maybe put your hands on your tummy, and kind of wait before you respond. Okay, so think about what you're saying and respond with genuine concern. Okay. Redirection, something that can be effective as well if children are quite physical with you. So if a child is trying to physically hurt you, you can redirect them, or you can attempt to redirect them. You could say something like, what this child is basically doing what they're doing when I mentioned projecting their experiences to you. They're just doing it in a physical way. So you could say something like, you want me to know what this felt like, or you want me to know what this experience felt like. My body doesn't need to hurt to understand you. You can show me another way. Show me another way, and keep kind of saying this to the child. So you're redirecting them, and eventually they can learn to show you how they feel in other ways instead of being physical. And the last bit I want to talk about is just self-care. So I don't know if any of you are aware, there's something called secondary trauma, which is something that can happen when you're working with one traumatized child, or it can be a group of traumatized children, or you're just in a school where you are interacting with a lot of traumatized children throughout the day. So this can happen when you are showing genuine empathy and concern for that child or children you're working with, because you are getting this kind of deep connection with the child or the children. It can affect your nervous system, and it can feel like you were exposed to that trauma. This is really common with therapists as well. So all therapists have to have something called supervision. So I have to have supervision once a month because I'm working with a lot of children who are quite traumatized, in close proximity, and I'm really kind of I'm affected by their trauma. So it's really important if you start to feel sad and you're feeling kind of quite low at the end of the week, you're not sure why. It could be because you've got a bit of secondary trauma. So it's really important to take care of yourself as well. So making sure that you are taking time, even if it's a bit of time, just to decompress after the week. Debriefing with other members of staff at the school so you can share your experience about how difficult things can be and how hard you're finding it. It's really important that you share how you feel. Obviously, this sounds really cheesy, but mindfulness, like spending time outside, just having some kind of physical activity can really help. And also making sure that you're setting boundaries with yourself as well. So, what is your emotional capacity? Are you at your limits? Do you need time to swap with another grown up for a minute so you can just reset? Okay, so be realistic about the amount of care you can give, and always focus on what you control in the here and now. Try not to get too worked up in what has happened in the past with this child or children you're working with. Just focus on what you can do and change now. That's the most important thing. Okay. Right, just before we finish, and have time for any questions, I'm just going to go over a couple of resources that I've put in that I think are quite useful, that might help you. Obviously, a lot of courses you have to pay for, they can be quite expensive. But the things I've listed here, they often do a lot of free training, and there's some good advice. So the first one is UK Trauma Council, and this has some really good information about trauma, guidance and practical advice as well. And then there's Child Trauma Resources. So this has specifically more resources that are better for kind of looking up adolescent trauma. So that might help for kind of secondary schools. Then there's the Anna Fraud Centre. So there's free evidence-based mental health resources on here, which can be really beneficial. I think sometimes they do trauma training on this website as well, that they do occasional free training that you can take a look at. Place to Be, mental health training for schools and parents. That's another really good one. Occasionally, they do free courses. I've been on there a few times and they will have free webinars coming up. They do have courses that you can pay for as well, but they're actually quite cheap. They're not super expensive. So it's definitely worth having a look at that. And then Trauma Informed UK. This is a really good website. They offer short courses, longer courses, CPD courses on trauma. And then I've put in a website here, helpguide.org. This has some really good information and explains a bit more about attachment styles and how they can affect relationships. Because attachment can be a really big part of a child's kind of mental well-being, and it kind of explains all the different styles on there a bit more thoroughly. So if you are working with a child, you could maybe perhaps recognize if they have an attachment problem and work out their kind of attachment style. And here's just a couple of reading suggestions as well. If any of you do like reading, these are just some books that I'd really recommend. The first one is The Boy Who Was Raised by a Dog, Raised as a Dog, sorry, by Dr. Bruce Perry. So he's a child psychiatrist. He's written some amazing books. He also offers training. If you Google him, there might be some really good webinars on YouTube you could watch. So this book specifically discusses case studies and the kind of healing journey of specific children he's worked with. I'm just pre-warning you, it is a very heavy book. You definitely have to take pauses when you're reading it. I wouldn't read it all in one go. it's quite sad. But it's a fascinating book, and it really kind of shows the journey of certain children. It's really interesting. Kim S. Golding's book, Using Stories to Build Bridges with Traumatized Children. This is really good. It's written by a psychologist, and it can show you more like creative ways you can build connections with children. And it's aimed for children aged 4 to 16. She talks about using stories or direct work to support the recovery from trauma. So there's some really nice ideas in there that you could use with children that you work with. And then the last one is written by Daniel A. Huge, who's a clinical psychologist, and it's Healing Relational Trauma with Attachment-Focused Interventions. So this talks a bit more about PACE that I've spoken about earlier, attachment theory again, and the impact of developmental trauma and the impact that it can have on young people when they're growing up. Okay. So that is the end of the training. I really hope that you found